We'll start off the second day of Balkan. I'd like to welcome Albert. He will lead us into the depths of Android and how to liberate it.
So, good morning. I hope everybody is awake. it's this time of the day that can be a bit of a challenge. Well, it's probably a bit fast. So, what is all it about? What is it all about? I mean, you have an Android phone, and well, it kind of works the way they deliver it to you, but it might contain a lot of software you don't want to run, and it might insist on putting your data in some cloud or, well, some other places you don't want it to. Or also, if you have older hardware, some vendors stop supporting their devices quite early and you don't get any security updates, which is also not nice to have. So, I forgot to change the date of the presentation and the location. That's the reason why you might want to install an alternative operating system. There is, of course, also the reason that, like myself, I prefer to mostly run free software. It's not that easy to only run free software on your mobile phone, because the drivers are usually with a lot of binary blobs in there, as well as the actual modem in there as well. But you can get the situation gets quite a bit better. So, what is free software actually? Free software is about, well, user freedom. It's not about free as in free beer. Well, it might be, but so the four freedoms you have is use, study, share, improve. So to use for any purpose, because the software should not, the license should not say, like I've seen that with Android ROMs, for example. Well, you're free to use it, but only for non-commercial use, for example. That's annoying. The other thing is obviously you should be allowed to study the software you're running to find out if it does what it should do and if it has any problems or how to do things. Also, you should be able to share whatever you found, because there should not be an NDA that says, well, it's nice that you have looked at our software and found all the security bugs, but you're not allowed to talk to anybody about it. And obviously also, after you've done all the work, you should also be allowed to actually improve software. So, I mean, for the basic stuff, it provides you with, it allows you to actually look at the software, investigate, audit the software without any restrictions. And as I said before, there is no NDA, so yes, you can publish your findings. It might still be nice to talk to the authors of the software first, so that you can have some responsible disclosure. Sorry. But they cannot force you not to publish. So now for the actual part of actually replacing the software on your mobile phone. The first and most important part of that is actually have a backup. I've listed a few things that are good to have a backup. It might not be complete. It depends a bit on what you're actually doing with your mobile phone. I mean, people do different things with it, have different software on there. Also, if possible, please test the backup and see if it really contains all your data. Because once you've overwritten the data, well, there is no way back, or no straightforward way at least. The next thing is, I mean, for most people, replacing the ROM on your Android phone is also about freeing it from things like the Google Cloud and other stuff. So please make sure that you're able to get your data out there, out of that before you deactivate your access. I mean, with Google, you can probably access all of it via the web interface. With other cloud-based applications, that might be a problem. So please check beforehand that you can access all your data, or at least all the data you want to access anymore. Because I mean, if you have any data that say, well, I don't care anymore, that's fine, but you should not find out by accident, and it's not good. So, well, preparations. Well, apart from having a backup, we already had said that, read the fine manual. And I really mean it. Read the fine manual completely before you start, because I've seen situations where people started the process by, well, basically starting while they were reading the manual, which is fine most of the time, but it can happen that you get stuck in the middle of it because you found out that you need some additional information, some additional tool you currently cannot access, and then you're stuck with a non-working phone in the middle of the day, which, well, if it's just a test device, then it's fine. If it's your main mobile phone, you're fucked. Also, of course, depending on your mobile phone, you might need different software packages. Most common one is that I've used so far is the Android SDK. Is nearly always, you nearly always need that. Depending, for example, for Samsung phones, they have a proprietary flashing process. I've also seen that with, what was it? I think some Lenovo devices also have some proprietary stuff. Some of them also use the more or less standard Google way. It really depends, and it's also a thing that you really have to look at your exact model. It's not like, well, my previous devices from this vendor work this way. That's true most of the time, but unfortunately not all of the time. So, well, yeah. So there are a few basic steps that I want to go through for the whole flashing process. The one thing is, usually first you have to unlock the bootloader, because Android devices by default come in a way where you can only install signed firmware signed by the original manufacturer. It's quite device specific. Yes, with most devices you have to enable developer mode first. Probably not with all. I've seen it on devices like, for example, Google Nexus 5. It's just, well, you send a command and you're done. I've had devices from Motorola, for example, where you have to create an account on the website and enter some data you get. You have to extract from device. It's usually, depending on where you get your ROM from, this part is usually in the instructions. I mean, for example, with Lineage OS, the instructions are quite good for the officially supported devices. There are, if you have a device that's only unofficially supported because somebody wrote something, that can be a bit of a challenge sometimes, because they leave out, some of the people then leave out stuff because, well, for me it was clear. Yes, for you maybe. Also, most of the devices will show in some way that the bootloader has been unlocked. I've seen that from, well, a small unlocked padlock on Google devices up to a full screen red warning while booting on some Motorola devices. You can actually overwrite that image, so if it annoys you, but still, don't get confused. Yes, of course, there are some implications if you don't run signed software, because obviously if you can install other software, somebody else can as well. So that's the downside, but it's not a major problem, actually. That's one of the examples of the warnings you get from some of the devices. It's just an example a friend of mine took. That's on the not so obvious side. As I said, it's really device dependent. Some of the manufacturers, actually, I think UI at some point said that while in the past it was easy to unlock our devices, they said, well, you're no longer allowed to do that with new devices. Unfortunately, you have to check. Ideally, if you plan to unlock your device, it's even a good idea to check before buying it. That's obviously not always easy. And sometimes you might even have some device that you already have, and then you have to check if it's possible. Yeah. The actual installation is usually quite painless, and usually didn't really completely do. It's not. You cannot really break your device. So most cases there is no step where if you don't completely fuck up, you cannot really destroy your device. It might not boot at the moment, but usually you have a second try. I've had one instance where that was not true for installing the bootloader, because for some Android devices have multiple bootloaders, and usually you use the first one to flash the second one, and the second one is the one you want to change. And I've had devices where you needed a working second bootloader to get into the first one. So user interface fuck up. But most of the time, it's really not an issue. And I had the problem before that I had a problem with the cable, or the power went out, or whatever, and then you just start from the beginning. It takes a bit more time, but it's really not a problem. The same with the firmware. Installing it is usually not a problem. You can, it's usually not dangerous to install it. The one thing you might have to take in mind is some manufacturers actually provide you with the original firmware, so you can go back, but not all of them do. I used to have, unfortunately, I physically broke them, so I don't have them with me today. For previous workshops, I used to bring Google devices for people to experiment with without risking their own phones. As I said, unfortunately, they're physically broken at the moment. These are quite nice because you can actually really get the original firmware. So if you try it out and you don't like it, you can really just reset it to factory mode and go back to how things were. Also, there's some strange typo in there. Also, if you want to install some additional stuff, you also have to do that at this step. And for some of that, you really have to do it when installing. I mean, you can get back into the bootloader and install additional stuff. Unfortunately, for example, if you want to have some of the Google services, there is an option for that with micro-G. I personally don't use it, but some people prefer to do it, for example, to have push notifications working, which is a bit better for battery runtime. For that, you really have to install it while installing the original ROM, because if you do it later, it will do a factory reset and clear all your data, which, well, is a bit of a problem. There is also, for example, something that's quite useful is the F-Droid privileged extension, which allows the F-Droid store to automatically update stuff and not just notify you that, yes, there are updates, please apply them. But with the extension, you're actually able to say, well, if I'm on Wi-Fi, you're allowed to update. Yeah. So, yeah. The pictures, as I said, are taken by a friend of mine. Well, picture in this case. So, that's the completely theoretical part about flashing. So, are there any people here who actually want to try to flash their phones? Okay, 2 of them. Are any of you interested? I mean, it's one thing to uninstall software, to kick out the Google stuff. The other thing is obviously that you need replacements. Are any of you also interested in information about how to replace stuff with other software? Show of hands. Okay, there's also some. So I might start a bit with that. I haven't prepared presentation slides for that, so I have to do it from my head, but that's fine. So we'll just do a small overview before trying to flash, because that can take a bit of time, and I mean, if not all of you are doing it. So obviously, while people, including myself, do not want to use the Google Cloud, it's still convenient. So there are quite a few services that you have to replace. For example, the whole contact synchronization stuff is really useful because, well, if, for example, you lose your phone and all your contacts are gone, or also with the calendar, you might want to use that on your laptop as well. For that, there is the WebDAV protocol that you can use for calendar and contact synchronization. There is a relatively good client for Android. It's called DAVdroid. It's done by some Austrian guys. It works quite well. On the server side, there are, depending on what you want, I mean, most people that I know run some kind of Nextcloud or OwnCloud. That, unfortunately, is a relatively big package that you need to wrestle with. There are some like Radical servers that only do contact and calendar synchronization. Yeah, if you need only the calendar and contacts, Nextcloud is probably overkill. I mean, it works, and yeah, it has some quirks, but it works. Some of the other stuff, I mean, I can really the other thing is, of course, the App Store. I've made some quite, I think F-Droid is quite good, but some people criticize it that they only provide free software, which I don't think is a downside, but well, some people think that they need some apps. There is the Yelp store, which you can also install via F-Droid, so you can install a store via a store, which actually allows you to extract and install certain applications from the Google Store. Obviously, quite a few of them will not work if you don't have any Google services, because the Google services that's not only the part that Google provides on the web, but it's also some libraries and stuff on your local phone. If they're missing, quite a few applications don't work. But one example that quite a lot of people that I know install via Yelp is Signal, the Signal Messenger, because, well, it's more or less free software. Well, it's from the license, it's free software. But the author sometimes has different opinions than other people on how you have to interpret the license, and therefore it's not there. There is some friction why it's not included in F-Droid directly. So, yeah, that's the big part. Is any services any of you are using that you might think that you need replacements for? So I was going through services and software that you might need to replace if you kick off the Google stuff from your phone and the cloud stuff. And I just wanted to ask, is there anything specific that any of you might think about that you might need replacements for? Well, Google Maps I usually replace with Awesome None, which works great in my opinion. I mean, it has some downsides. For example, I mean, it's great. It routes great, and it actually has quite good maps in places where, well, the official hiking maps are a bit broken. But yeah. The problem is a bit that, at least for some people, it does not do public transport routing, unfortunately. That's a bit of a that's a bit of a downside. For that, I usually use Transporter, which is also quite useful. It's a small app that can interact with quite a lot of public transport providers all over the world. Not all of them, because, well, some of the providers don't provide an open interface to their systems. Some of them, we had this problem in Austria. The Wiener Linien at some point even threatened people when they reverse engineered the interface their proprietary application uses to contact their servers. They threatened to sue because, well, you're not only allowed to use that with our software. I don't understand that, but, well, it happens. But I've really made quite good. I've really made quite good progress with that, and in most cases it works. Obviously, if the data it gets is broken, well, it's because, for example, I know the problem in Vienna. The application now works correctly with it, but for some reason the API does not say if it doesn't have data, because for some reason it does not know where the underground is at the moment, which is a bit frightening because most of the time they drive automatically, and then it's a bit frightening if the system doesn't know where it is. But, well, they start to put in the system where they usually put in it comes in 5 minutes, they start to put in the actual when it should come because of the timetable. So they just put in, instead of 5, they put in there 11:15 or something, which, well, if you know it, well, yeah, of course you can interpret it, but you have the same problem with their normal signs because, well, they do the same stuff because they just write the time there and tell nobody that, well, actually we don't know when it's coming. So, well, any other stuff that, yeah?
How do you do basement updates when you unlock the phone?
Well, if there are updates, they will be included in some way in the updates for your ROM, hopefully. A bit of a problem, of course, is that if you have some phone that's no longer supported by the original vendor, then it gets a bit complicated because usually then there are no baseband updates for that anymore, or, well, there might be because some other phone might have the same chip and you could extract that, but I'm not. I wouldn't count on that actually happening.
Are you sure about this? Because when I switched back to the vendor's image, I immediately got a basement update, which was issued a couple months ago, and it was not applied in the lineage was updated.
Yeah. Well, I think the problem is that with lineage you have the same problem like with quite a few other projects. It's the individual images are prepared by different people, and some of them work in other ways than others. Also, the problem is also that for different vendors, they have different licensing for the baseband and how to get to it, obviously. But yes, it's an issue. But for most devices that I've seen so far, lots of devices that I've had in hand for flashing don't have vendor support anymore as it is, so, well, you at least get the software updates. But yes, of course, it's the baseband is a bit of a problem. The other problem is if you have a Lineage OS device that they support, even for the original vendor does not support it anymore, and they sometimes take quite a lot of work to actually port the newer Android version to your device. Unfortunately, Android vendors took a slightly annoying way on handling the Linux kernel, because usually the chip manufacturers fork the Linux kernel, put in their drivers there, and then hopefully provide security update for that branch. Unfortunately, that model, of course, is a problem, because as soon as they stop supporting the device, it's harder to get security fixes. Also, sometimes I've seen that with relatively new devices where there were no, so Lineage OS had to drop them because it's, or for newer Android versions, because they said, well, for the newer Android version, we need a newer kernel, but we can't really do that for this device, because that would mean to extract all the drivers from the vendor tree and forward port them to some other kernel, which, well, I don't know if any of you have tried to forward port kernel drivers. I've looked at a bit at it, and it's a bit of a pain in the ass sometimes, I think. Yeah. But yes, I mean, the point is valid that baseband and other firmware that's in there might be updated by the vendor and might not be by Lineage OS or I mean, there is not only LineageOS, of course there are others as well. Lineage is one of the bigger ones that have support for quite a few devices. Yeah. Other questions or things you might want to point out? Okay, I think we could start. I mean, it's unfortunately with only 2 people wanting to actually flash the phone. It's a bit, with the size of the group, that's even hard for watching. But we could start with that now. Yeah. So I think the presentation part is more or less over. And we'll continue with the actual flashing part. I'm not sure how. So which were the guys who wanted to flash the phone? So you don't know? No, I try to be honest. It's because it's what kind of device do you have?
I have a Nokia with everything related on it.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I haven't had any Nokia devices yet to flash, so I'm not even sure about the procedure. We would have to look at it.
Never mind.
Okay. For you?
I would like to touch the phone of the public.
Okay. Well, with tablets, the support is kind of lacking depending on the model. I'm not sure what kind of model do you have.
It's Samsung Galaxy Tab 6.
I have not so far. I have not seen any ROMs for that because I'm working with stuff like that at work as well, and for whatever reason, the alternative ROMs seem to ignore tablets at the moment. There used to be some support. Now they ignore it. I'm not sure if it's just that the market share dropped for non-Apple tablets, or the people who. Yeah, no, the problem is if we don't have ROM, we won't start porting Android to LineageOS to a new device today, because I don't think that that's a feasible way to go. I've invested some weeks in that. Okay, that's a bit unfortunate, as I said, especially since I don't have test devices. Okay. Okay, what do we do? So, okay. Yeah, okay.
I don't want to flash my phone.
Yeah, well, it's fine.
Future. Samsung S7.
Most of the Samsung devices that I know of work quite well. The phones, with tablets is a bit of a different thing. They tend to work relatively well from my experience. I think the S7 is on the supported list. Check. It's the procedure is a bit different than, for example, for Google phones, but it mostly works.
Actually, this is my first phone that is still running.
Yeah, well, it's I mean, it's usually somebody has a reason to run it in a way. I mean, a friend of mine also said, well, he needs, for example, the Google payment services, and so, well, But yeah, it's so for some reason I don't have internet at the moment. But yeah, it's if you try it the first time, I would recommend to have ample time available where you don't immediately need the phone, because
I flashed all my previous phones.
okay.
So just
No, because a friend of mine once said, well, when he got the phone, he tried to flash it, and then said, okay, now I don't have a working phone and I need to leave for a business trip in 2 hours. That's a situation you should try to avoid. Unless, of course, you say, well, I don't care, I have a backup phone, but... Okay. Laptop doesn't like me today. I'll look it up later for you. Yeah, it's the Samsung devices, depending on if you run Linux or Windows on your device, it's usually either Heimdall or Odin. Odin usually works for more devices because the Heimdall guys have to keep up, because from what I've seen, Odin seems to be more or less directly from Samsung. But it seems actually not usually have been meant for end users. So I think that's it, from the look of it, it was more geared towards the shops, where they obviously also sometimes have to reflash stuff. The nice thing is with the Samsung devices, usually you can also get the original firmware if you need to get back to some point. One problem they have is that while from Google you just go to the Google site and then say, well, yes, 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 and then you have to agree to some terms, but you can get the official image from Google. For Samsung, there are official sites unofficial sites where you can get the images, which, well, mostly works, but is of course from the trust. There might be some trust issues if you have to revert to it. I didn't care that much for the devices. I had to do it for work because they, well, are running in some isolated network anyway and don't handle any private data, because they're basically feedback devices that display stuff and have some buttons. So there I don't have an issue if it's a phone where I handle personal information of other people, then might be different considerations.
You just said that there are trust issues. As far as I know, if the image is signed, you reload the bootloader, you can ensure that up to a certain extent.
Yes, yes.
Images, there are a flaw in that signature chain.
Well, it's I would not. I mean, for some of the tablets, I mean, sometimes for some of the devices you cannot relock the bootloader once you unlock it. That's one issue, especially if you afterwards install some more or less untrusted stuff. That's one issue. The other issue is that for some of the Samsung devices, I'm not completely sure what they exactly verify, because even if the bootloader and the kernel are trusted, that's usually the part they verify by signature. There still might be some userland stuff that has been replaced and is running in the background, as if they replace some daemon in the userland part, that still might have quite a bit of access to stuff if it's running as a root user. So that's also a bit of an issue. For that, you would have to check the exact what are they actually verifying? Because as far as I know, I mean, all of them verify the kernel, that the kernel is signed, which is a big part, obviously, but I mean, obviously you can also steal stuff from userland, even if Android tries to isolate applications as far as possible. Any other questions? Yeah. Okay.
And I found it really difficult to find knobs. And I looked on XDA developers, but I wasn't sure if there were some other sites where I could find it.
I mean, XDA developers is definitely a good starting point. I tend to, but it's easier for me because I usually select my phones for various methods beforehand. I usually go quite a bit with officially LineageOS supported devices because there I also know that I get updates. And the nice thing about LineageOS is that they also have over-the-air updates for the officially supported devices so that you don't need to go through the whole flashing procedure for every security update, which has its advantages. That's the one thing. There is obviously there are some ROMs that I'm a bit too tired today because I'm missing a name here, but I mean there are some ROMs that go even quite a bit further about kicking out all the non-free stuff. The problem is that they tend to also kick out drivers with that. And personally, I would not recommend a ROM for the phone to people that says, well, yes, you now have a phone that doesn't contain any proprietary code, but unfortunately you don't have Wi-Fi, you don't have a camera, and you don't have Bluetooth anymore. That might work for some people. And it might not work for others. I mean, yes, then there's the option. I've seen people who then actually have attached USB-connected Wi-Fi dongles to their phones. Actually, I find it quite a bit more convenient if it's built in. I mean, I don't care if it's a bit thicker, but it should have everything built in, I think. Yeah. Well, I mean, that said, I really saw the difference over the years that some vendors, well, I mean, as I said, UI, I think, they said, well, we won't provide that anymore because we won't provide the option to unlock anymore. There's some, I have had experience with some Sony phones a few years ago where, well, officially they provided the option to unlock, but they would have you jump through hoops with creating an account and calling the service hotline, and well, you get the impression that they don't want you to do that. Yeah, I mean, obviously people also change over time. I'm not sure, it might be better now as well.
I remember Sony, like more than 5 years ago, they were pretty lenient on the whole line.
Yeah. No, it's yeah. Yeah, it's as I said, I mean, company policy changed over time, partly because, well, also because different people are at the helm of companies over time. Well, as I said, for me, I made at some point started to look into the whole procedure. Can it be unlocked? Is there a chance for an alternative firmware actually before buying the phone? Which, well, in hindsight, it's easier, but yeah. Any other questions or remarks? Well, I think then we'll close the session even if it's quite a bit earlier than expected, because I was hoping for the practical part. I really have to get new phones for people to play with. Yeah. So, thank you. And